Thank you again for those who are joining us. I know people are now streaming in via Zoom as well as on Facebook. So now that it's just a couple minutes after 2, I think we're going to get started. Really honored to have with us today the Reverend David Andrews and the Reverend Shannon Jammal-Hollemans. I will introduce them both in just a minute, but to give some context for this webinar and the work that we're doing, my name is Kyle Christopholo, and I am with Churches for Middle East Peace. I direct our engagement with Congress, as well as the administration, as well as the coalition partners that we work with. Churches for Middle East Peace, as many of you know, is a coalition of nearly 30 national Christian denominations and organizations that span the Christian theological spectrum, so evangelicals, mainline Protestants, historic peace churches, Catholic and Orthodox. And so we're really glad to have 2 local parish pastors from 2 of those communions with us today. Churches for Middle East Peace is committed to pushing for U.S. government policies that will help result in a just and lasting end to the conflict in Israel-Palestine and throughout the Middle East as a whole. And so over the past several months, we have been troubled by the drumbeat toward de jure official annexation of parts of the West Bank. Of course, we have known that for years there have been the de facto annexation and the movement toward the official, but really concerned by the implications of official annexation of parts of the Area C. Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel has indicated that he will move toward that as early as July 1. So we've launched here at Churches for Middle East Peace a Churches Against Annexation webinar and campaign, and included in that campaign is a webinar series. So last week we heard from Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac in Bethlehem and Father Jamal Hadder in Ramallah. And so this is again the second part of this series. We're encouraging folks, if you haven't seen already, we do have this Churches Against Annexation campaign, and we'll have more information hopefully in the chat about ways that you can join, including via social media. We have graphics that you can print out and post on your Twitter account, and then mention your congressional representatives so that it's getting more traction. Just before I introduce our speakers for today, 2 minor technical issues. We will open up time at the end for question and answers. So we ask that you use the Q&A function. If you're on a laptop, you can find that at the lower end of the screen on the far hand right. So to use the Q&A if you have questions. And then feel free to use the chat if you want to just introduce yourself, say where you're joining from, so that we can have conversations in that regard. But again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A button, and we'll get to those later. So please, at any time during the webinar, you're free to ask your questions there. So I'll start by introducing both of our speakers, and then I'm going to pass it over first to Reverend Andrews. So Reverend Andrews is the rector at the Episcopal Church of St. Martin's and Matthew in Wilmington, Delaware. One of his passions is to open the church to the world in the spirit of radical hospitality. He believes Jesus calls us to welcome all, no matter who they are or where they come from. Prior to his current position, he served as a rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Castine, Maine. Castine is a coastal community located in what is known as Downeast, Maine. He's also served congregations in New York as well. And I'll introduce Reverend Shannon and then pass it over to you, Reverend David. Reverend Shannon Jammal-Hollemans is currently a pastor at Oakdale Park Christian Reformed Church in Michigan. She's based in the Grand Rapids area, where she lives with her husband and 3 young adult children. Reverend Jammal-Hollemans has traveled to the Middle East numerous times in the past 20 years, has written for her denomination's publications about peace and justice, issues in the region, and has extensive history of working within the realm of interfaith work, both in the US and abroad, and has family in the south of Lebanon. So I'm going to start again with Reverend David, and then Reverend Shannon, ask you to answer the same question. So just to help situate the conversation to begin with, if you could answer how Israel-Palestine advocacy has become a part of your ministry, and then what that looks like in your current capacity, in your current vocation.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. Just a word of correction, it's the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew.
I'm sorry about that.
So it's good to be here today. And if I could give some words of background about who I am and how I got involved with this ministry, that I've been traveling to the Holy Land and Palestine since 1977 as a 19-year-old college freshman. At that time, the wall had not been built. You were not able to travel through the Jordan. You were through Shechem, you had to go around the other way because of disturbances, if I remember correctly, going up to Galilee. That trip was transforming for me for many reasons. I consider Israel-Palestine my spiritual home. I then traveled back for 2 summers after graduation from college, and before starting seminary, I participated in 2 archaeological digs up north in northern Galilee. Then several trips with several tours with my wife and with church groups. But then in 2005, I attended a course at St. George's College in East Jerusalem, which really began my advocacy for Palestinians. I was there for Eastern Orthodox Holy Week and spent much of my time on the streets of Jerusalem. But at the end of the course, another course participant invited me to go to Hebron with her. She was part of the Christian peacekeepers that are located in Hebron. And that's when it began to change. I mean, throughout that entire trip in 2005, I began seeing the wall and the wall being increased in stages at that time. But then getting to Hebron and seeing settlers right on top of the old city of Hebron, along with a military force to protect the settlers from Palestinians. But then walking the old streets of Hebron and seeing the refuse and the garbage poured out by the settlers onto the streets of the old city of Hebron just made me sick. And really began to realize that I needed more facts on the ground in terms of what was going on, because we don't hear about that in this country. We don't hear about what settlers are doing or what the Israeli army is doing in these cities in the West Bank. And so that really began my outrage. That followed up in 2007. I attended a Sabeel trip with Sabeel from the folks in Maine where we were. And again, more facts in terms of home demolitions, going back to Hebron, speaking with Palestinians whose homes had been bulldozed, speaking with Palestinians whose lives in the refugee camp in Bethlehem, and seeing the reality of what was happening on the ground. Most recently, I went at the end of January, right before COVID-19 hit. And we arrived in Jerusalem. We were at St. George's College again, and we were there the day that the peace treaty of the century was announced. And again, just one more for me slap in the face to the Palestinians in terms of having to yet again give up something without anything in return. They weren't even at the table. And so we were there for 10 days, and on the last day, just as one more thing about that trip, is that we were visiting St. Anne's Church when we were blocked from going back in the streets because of disturbance where a Palestinian youth had been killed by the police, by the Israeli police and military forces. So that's all to say that this has been a part of my ministry in terms of preaching about it, being a part of Delaware Churches for Middle East Peace, J Street, finding ways to try to connect people to what's going on, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. Not so much in my parish in Delaware, but in other churches I've served, where people they always just go, their default position is, oh, Israel's right to exist. Israel's, they need security, without any thought of the human rights issues that are happening on the ground. So with that, I'll pass it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Reverend Andrews. Pastor Shannon.
Yeah, growing up as an Arab American in the United States, I've always been familiar with this issue. It was something that mattered a lot to my father, who is from the south of Lebanon, and I have uncles and cousins who are Palestinian. So when I became ordained in this denomination as a pastor in 2014, my work began at our denominational offices, and much of my work there involved mobilizing churches and raising awareness around this issue in particular. So today, now that I'm serving in a parish, I sort of see two ways where I work on this issue in my ministry. The first is through preaching. And preaching is ultimately storytelling, right? Inviting people to connect the dots between the grand narrative of Scripture and their lives today, and identifying particularly the parallels in the systems of injustice at work around the world. I do this through sharing my stories of experiences in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine, and sharing numbers, sharing statistics, so people know the magnitude and the scope of what is happening right now. There's the woman who I stayed with when I was there in 2010, who shared with me how she was driving her 13-year-old daughter to a park to play with friends when some young Israeli soldiers threw tear gas through the moonroof of her car, and just the horror of that moment. I remember her husband showing me his ID card that had the number 2 on it to indicate that he was a second-class citizen. I remember seeing the checkpoint system, which forces people to stand in line for hours in the hot sun only to be denied the right to travel just 3 miles from their home. And, I'll never forget speaking with Palestinians in the West Bank who told me they'd never seen the Mediterranean Sea and asked me what it looked like because they had never had the opportunity to go there. So I think sharing those stories helps debunk the myths too, the myths that say that there are just 2 sides to this issue and that you need to pick one or the other, or that this is a centuries-old religious conflict that we need to back off of, not to be divisive, when frankly that's not the gospel and not how God works in this world. I want people in my community to learn that the issues of injustice are not just issues, but they involve people, and as such, they're not peripheral to the good news of the gospel, but they are central to it, right? And the other way that I like to do that in my ministry is through political advocacy. Churches for Middle East Peace has been a great ally in this because they provide a number of opportunities by offering regular action alerts, hosting meetings in Washington, D.C. when it's safe to do so, that give us opportunities to advocate with our representatives in person and by phone and by email to advocate for more just policies. Politics in the church can be hard, especially for those of us who grew up in mostly white churches. Many of us are not comfortable with the mixing of politics and church, and politics sometimes can get a bad name in the church. But that tension is precisely where God's invited us to live. It's not easy, and that's precisely why we should be there. Yesterday, my husband and I put 2 banners up on our church property that say Micah 6 verse 8, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, and at the bottom, Black Lives Matter. When I got to church this morning, some winds had blown through last night and both banners were flat on the ground. I see that as a beautiful image of what this work involves, right? Doing the work, getting knocked down, putting it back up again, and really testifying to the power of the gospel through our persistence, through our persistent love of one another, and how we live that message out in advocating for those who are being hurt right now.
Thank you, Reverend Shannon. And I think I'm going to stick with you for the next question because you're helping us move into what that next question is. So I'm glad that worked out. Right now we want to acknowledge that we know that we're obviously in a difficult place in our country at the moment with the rise of at least the knowledge of police brutality and systemic racism, with the recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. And so there are a lot of Christians in the pews that are figuring out how they involve themselves in those conversations. And of course, there's other things related to immigration and the environment. So I'm just wondering how, in light of everything that is going on, do you encourage Christians to also at this moment be concerned about annexation?
Yeah, I think what I see most often in the church is people become so overwhelmed by the issues of injustice in our world right now, the ways that people are being harmed, the ways their rights are being violated, that we turn inward and we shut it all out, that we become so overwhelmed that we're paralyzed into inaction, right? And I think the primary way that the enemy, right, the devil, stops the people of God or tries to stop the people of God from following God into the work to which we've been called, which is restoring the brokenness in this world, is distraction, distracting us specifically with self-centered concerns, right? In this time of COVID-19, we're concerned about our safety, about the safety of our friends and our families. And it would be easy to turn inward and ignore the pain of the world around us and focus on our own pain right now. That's the way sin works, right? But God calls us to keep our eyes focused on God and what God is doing in this storm so that we can continue to follow God through it. Black lives matter, Palestinian lives matter. We need to be working to advocate for any marginalized people whose lives are being destroyed right now. And the larger picture is that God wants us to see the value of every human life, to advocate for the lives of every person created in God's image, right? We're called to serve God not in limited ways, but with our votes, with our advocacy. In Philippians 2, Paul explicitly reminds believers, right? Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but rather in humility consider others better than yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but to the interests of others. I just lament the ways that we as North American Christians have started to believe the lie that we can vote for our own interests first and foremost above the interests of others, that we don't have power to leverage to advance human rights, to speak up for others, to change these policies that are hurting our communities, because it hurts all of us, whether it's us seeing the direct repercussions of these unjust systems or the moral injury that is done by us ignoring it, because God will hold us responsible for what we do and what we don't do. So I think we just need to fight that temptation to be distracted and to turn our eyes away from what God is doing in the world right now.
Thank you. Before I move it on to you, Reverend David, there was just a note in the Q&A. I don't know, Shannon, if you could maybe turn up your volume or your mic. There was just a little difficulty with some folks hearing you. So for the next question, but now I'll turn it over with the same question to you, Reverend Andrews.
I just want to add what Shannon says. I think she's spot on. But I think what people should be concerned about annexation, I mean, for especially Christians in this country, is how it's going to affect Christians, Palestinian Christians, and Christians in the Middle East in terms of their ability to move around, to be able to go to Bethlehem, to be able to go to Jerusalem, to be able to visit loved ones, to again, there being the treatment of being second-class citizens, and the fact that this is going to lead to violence, it seems to me, but also it'll just be one more difficult path for Palestinian Christians to be able to worship God, and to be safe. And I think, as Shannon said, I mean, the days of our self-interest, I think, have to end. We really do need to continue to pray for and to do what we can from afar to help those who are going to be living with the burden of this in 3 short weeks.
Thank you. And that helps transition to the next the question. So thank you. We didn't intend for this to sync up this well, but thank you in that response. So last week, as I mentioned earlier, we heard from Reverend Winther Isaac and Father Jamal Hader. And to your point, Reverend Andrews, they talked about the devastating impact that annexation will have on the Palestinian community as a whole, but then focusing on some of the repercussions for the Palestinian Christian community specifically. And the very real reality is that if things continue, it's possible that we're looking at the possibility that there will be no Christian community in the faith, in the place where our faith began. And so I'm wondering, again, the purpose of this webinar is to hear from 2 pastors in the pews to get a bit more theological and to reflect on how some of these issues impact our faith. And so I'm just wondering, does that have implications for the Christian faith more broadly? The fact that we might lose a Christian presence in the place where our faith began? Obviously, we're concerned primarily about the human rights and well-being of our brothers and sisters in Palestine, but just any response you might have to how that impacts our faith. And again, we'll start with you, Pastor David, and then Pastor Shannon.
I think it does impact our faith in terms of our love for one another. In terms of one of my favorite images of is just, there won't even be a faithful remnant left. I mean, there may very well be very few people, and I think for us who are from this country, it almost feels like a new exodus or a new exile, that these folks are going to be taken away from what they believe. And I think that has implications for us. I'm not sure what those repercussions are at the moment, but I mean, we're all in this, and folks, we're 1,000 miles away, but we can't help but lament that loss. We can't help but lament the fact where Jesus was born, that this land will be. I mean, I hope it would not have it, but all of a sudden, if these stones could speak, if these stones could shout out and cry as to what's happening and what has happened over thousands of years. And now we're seeing it in real time. If indeed Christians were to leave the Middle East, I will say all those countries, and especially Palestine, Israel, it would be very sad. And it would be, and I think we need to rise up in this country to share our opposition to that happening, however that might be. So.
Thank you, Pastor Shannon.
Yeah, I think the loss of the Palestinian Christian presence in Israel and the Palestinian territories is devastating, and it's been coming for a long time now, right? My grandparents were Lebanese, but they lived in the port city of Haifa in 1947, and at that time, 8% of the population in that area was Christian. My grandparents were among the majority, the Muslim population. But just 20 years before that, the population was 10%, and now it's less than 1%. I believe today there are currently about 150,000 Arab Christians in Israel, between 12 and 15,000 Messianic Jews in Israel, and between 50 and 70,000 Christians in the Palestinian territories. Those numbers are alarming. I think most of the Palestinian Christians around the world are not in Palestine. They are in other countries like the United States. On a 2017 trip to Israel and the Palestinian territories, I met with Archbishop Attallah Hanna, who spoke with our group about the posture of North Americans and the damage that that is doing in the region. He was very concerned about the evangelical Christian support for Israel to the detriment of the Christian population in Palestine. They know our voice matters. They know we can make a difference. They said, we can handle things on the ground here if you equip and support us with the resources that we need. If you share our story around the world, if you vote for policies that are more just. As evangelical Christians, we have a load to bear for the seeds of discord we've sown by perpetuating a narrative that this is ultimately a religious conflict when it's not. That this is ultimately about power and taking power in the ways that we as human beings greedily seek power in the ways that harms others. So I would love to see us as the North American Christian churches continue to pray for the Palestinian Christians and seek ways that they can live in the land to which they were born in ways that are safe and healthy and have hope for the future for their children and grandchildren.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Another touch point from last week's webinar was Reverend Munther Isaac, who referenced the statement that was sent by 27 Christian church leaders opposing annexation to Congress, thanking them for that, but also noting that he felt that it was time that we needed to move beyond statements to action, and so encouraging us to consider that. I'm wondering, and that goes from the leadership all the way down to the pews, right? It's not just the leaders that we need to move to action. So if you both could speak to, and maybe we'll hear from Shannon first, what are ways you think Christians in the pews can take tangible steps to support freedom and equality for all in Israel, Palestine, and really at this moment speak up against annexation?
Yeah, I think there are a number of ways that we can do that. I think one, being in touch with the news, with what's going on, and you have to seek it out, right? But that's a way that we can connect the dots for ourselves. One story that still gets to me is that in 2016, the US Department of Justice published a report that documented widespread constitutional violations, discriminatory enforcement policies, and a culture of retaliation by the Baltimore Police Department, right? This was after another Black man had been killed. Just prior to that, the Baltimore Police Department had received training on crowd control, the use of force, and surveillance from Israel's national police, from their military, and from their intelligence services. Some of these trainings are privately funded by groups like the Anti-Defamation League, but for 28 years, the Department of Justice actually has subsidized these trainings through grants to states like Georgia. Since 1992, I believe more than 1,700 participants, police officers, have been trained, including officers from the Atlanta Police Department, Baltimore, and others around the country, right? When we know those kinds of things, when we understand the connections between injustice here and injustice around the world, we're compelled to do something about it, to share those stories, to pray about it, to connect with the advocacy and action alerts that CMEP sends out, to invite others to learn about it with us, and ultimately to share the stories with our representatives, to join the work that's already being done. We don't have to start at square one, but there are a lot of people mobilized already that we just need to join alongside to help and make a difference.
Thank you. Reverend Andrews, if you have anything to add.
Before COVID, I would say go and visit. Go. If you can travel to Israel, Palestine, go on a mission trip with Sabeel. Go to St. George's College, where the staff is Palestinian, where you'll see and learn from them as to how life is at the moment. Read authors from the Middle East, Elaine Pape, read Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Be curious. as to what's happening. Be vigilant and call your representatives in Congress, and keep at it until they respond. And if they don't respond, keep at it. Write letters. Find aid agencies in Palestine that you could send supplies or money to help, because they're going to need it. But everything you can do, but do not take for granted the narrative we've been hearing in this country. Learn about the other narrative from the other side, which will be a very different point of view than the conservative evangelical Christians in this country, who sadly want to see something blow up in Israel, Palestine, but do not take their point of view as gospel. Find ways of listening and learning from people who know what's happening.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one final question and then open it up for the Q&A. There are already a number of questions that are there. I ask that for those that are asking questions in the Q&A, remember, for our panelists in this, they are knowledgeable about the political situation, but the reason we invited them and the purpose of this particular webinar is really to focus in on how can we engage, from a theological, from a perspective of getting folks in the pews. So we might not get to some of the very complex political questions, but if you ask them of me and CMEP, I'd be happy to respond after the fact. So just for those that will continue to ask questions, if they can be framed in that regard, that would be most helpful. So I guess to finish it off in this line of questioning, many pastors and lay folks might want to and view now as a good time, given annexation, to bring this up with their congregations, but they have fears that this issue is seen to be as too divisive, or it's getting too much into the politics. Or Reverend Shannon, you talked a little bit about that in an earlier response. But I'm wondering what advice, and we'll start with you, Reverend David, what advice you have for pastors or lay folks who are interested in engaging on issues of annexation in Israel-Palestine, but don't know where to start, or just afraid that they might get too much pushback from others in the congregation for it being too divisive.
Read the Gospels. Jesus was divisive. Go to the Beatitudes. Again, like I said earlier, just be curious. Be honest about how you feel. I mean, you're gonna get pushback. But so did Jesus. Jesus got pushback too. I think it's, maybe if to educate yourself and your congregation together. Be co-learners in this. If you don't know what it's about, then watch a DVD called Palestine for Beginners, which outlays the entire what's going on. Read the Kairos document from the Episcopal Church and from the Presbyterian Church. Ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. You may not have the, don't be afraid if you don't have the answer. You're not going to have the answer because it's not an easy answer. But listen to where people are coming from. But also, listen to your own heart. If you see what's going on is wrong, then preach it. Yes, you're going to get pushback. But I guess we can no longer be silent about any of these issues, even the issues here going on in our own country. Silence is no longer an option. And I say that for myself as well. So I think for me, the biggest thing is learn together. If you don't know much, educate yourselves, and then in your own context, then come up with a plan as to what you can do.
Reverend Shannon.
Yeah, I would echo Reverend Andrews. Don't be afraid. We hear that again and again in Scripture, right? Fear not, I'm with you. Jesus said in John 16:33, "In the world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world." Don't be afraid to bring this into your preaching, to start discussion groups. Yeah, it will be hard, and there's going to be pushback, and there are things that all of us have to learn, to hear more stories, to hear the many facets of what's going on in God's world, right? There are a lot of great resources out there, as Reverend Andrews said. The book Blood Brothers by Father Elias Shakur. Gary Burge is a theologian at the seminary I attended, Calvin Theological Seminary, who has a great book called Jesus and the Land about the New Testament challenges to Holy Land theology. And Dale Hansen-Bork is someone I heard speak at a CMEP conference a number of years ago. And she has a great little book called The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, Tough Questions, Direct Answers. Those are great ways to introduce people to the history and to what's going on. But there are also a lot of great films. Films really speak to me. So films like Five Broken Cameras, The Lemon Tree with Chaim Abbas, Little Town of Bethlehem. They tell a lot of powerful stories and include many voices. And there are resources to grow in your awareness as well. SsAM is an organization doing great work in Israel to raise awareness about the human rights violations. Jewish Voices for Peace, doing great work in the US context to connect the dots between injustice here and injustice being experienced in Israel and the Palestinian territories. God is doing a lot, and there are a lot of opportunities to join in that work. We just have to sit sometimes and listen and follow the way God's voice is calling us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really, again, grateful for the both of you for taking the time to be with us today and for these words. I'm going to transition now to some of the questions that we've received in the Q&A, and I'll try to group some of them together. The first one asks if either of you have encountered questions from parishioners about, the Jewish people or Israel's God-given right to the land, which then can be used as a theological warrant for annexation. And if that has happened, could you how have you responded to that? So I'll if one of you wants to raise your hand first, or, okay, Reverend Andrews.
I have not had that question asked to me. And I serve a pretty progressive congregations, but I've not heard, that has not come up in any conversation I've had.
Reverend Shannon, do you have anything to add to that question?
She's frozen.
You might be frozen. Well, hopefully we can get you back on, Reverend Shannon. We're not able to hear you at the moment, so we're going to turn it over to you, Reverend Andrews, for the rest of the questions. Do you have a sense of how you might answer that if it was given to you?
Well, I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Sort of how, God has given the land to the Jewish or the state of Israel, and that's sort of a warrant for annexation.
Well, I go back to the fact that before the state of Israel it was not Jewish land. I need to get my history right, but I guess I'd have to think about that question. That's a hard one, but I don't think they necessarily have the right, but that's my own personal opinion.
Yeah, I know that's a tough question.
That's a good question. And in my former congregation in Maine, that question wasn't asked quite that way, but when I came back from the Sabile trip, I had folks who were just dead set against talking about Palestinian rights or that Israel was an apartheid state. And I think it had to do, I think, generally with that, what you said, Kai, with that question, in terms of, well, it's God-given, then how can they possibly give it up? Or how can they possibly share it? And I guess it goes back for me, it's compassion, it's loving your brother and your sister. And I mean, it's really, it's unfortunate, it's an unfortunate, hard question, but I don't think, well, I don't, I mean, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that because I'm fumbling for words.
No, we know that's a challenging question. So there were a couple of others that, and you might not also have encountered this directly within your congregations, but a couple of questions that we're answering around, do congregants sort of understand the role that the Christian Zionist movement has played in Christian views toward Israel-Palestine? Are they aware of that, of the large groups? Is that a conversation that you're having, even if you don't have folks from those perspectives within your congregation? You know, is that a conversation that you all have?
We've not had it, but that's a great conversation to have. I mean, I've not had that conversation, but I think it's especially after our last trip in January about the influence of Christian Zionism there now in the Holy Land, in terms of they're pushing for the third temple, and Christian and rich Christian evangelicals are supporting that movement, that they're just waiting for the third temple to come again. But I guess since I mean, this is my humanity speaking, that since I don't particularly care for Christian Zionists, so it's almost like I hate to say it, I could be bothered. However, it'd be good to have a conversation as to what are the difference between Christian Zionism, say, and Churches for Middle East Peace. I mean, they're so diametrically opposed, but I think it's, kind of like know your opposition. But again, I've not been asked. That's a question I've not been asked recently.
There's another question, and I know, Pastor Andrews, you talked about this briefly as how you became awakened to what's happening and going there and seeing the situation. Have you taken directly folks from your parish or wider community on pilgrimages to the Holy Land? And if so, what has that been like? How has that been illuminating to them, and how has that process been for them?
In 2014, we took a group of 26 people from my parish for it was a 9-day trip organized by Quest, which is a Palestinian travel group out of Georgia. And it was a very quick, it was like, Tuesday you're in Jerusalem, Wednesday you're in Galilee. I mean, it's like boom, boom, boom. You're just moving all the time. And our guide, when we first got on the bus, our first day, was very hesitant, because this is a group of folks who wanted to know about the facts on the ground. And Rami was very hesitant at first to talk about his feelings. But by the end, he was talking. I don't remember specifically what he said, but he was able to share some of his own feelings as we went around the country in a very quick order. But that trip really did open the eyes of the folks who went on that trip, especially folks who are African-American, who was predominantly African-American, and just making the connections between Israel, Palestine, and this country, and beginning to see the connections between the two, between the two.
Thank you. There were some questions, I'm just going to address them in the audience, about the resources that were shared, I think specifically by Reverend Shannon, but also Reverend Andrews. I'll ask both of them to send me that, and we can send that out in an email that goes out to all of the registrants with the recording. So yes, if folks were not able to write down all of the books or the resources that were listed, we can make sure to get that to you. There was also a question that I'll answer about, are there plans to do virtual tours of Hebron or other locations in Israel, Palestine now? that physical travel is less feasible. And I did see through the chat some folks mentioning that the group's Eyewitness Palestine is doing some virtual opportunities. That would be an organization to look at if you are interested in what's happening in that regard. So just trying to make my way through the questions. Let's see. There was a question of, are you aware within your congregation and the church, the Episcopal Church, larger Episcopal Church, of programs like the EAPPI and CPT, Christian Peacemaker Teams, and the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program?
That's a good question for, I think, the Episcopal Church. And I mean, I know there are Episcopalians who I think are involved with Christian Peacekeepers, but I don't think we have our own set group, if that's what the question is.
I guess if anyone from your congregation had, or the diocese had participated in those programs or were aware of them. The EAPPI program is a volunteer program for 3 months.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to if someone were interested, I would definitely talk to them about. I mean, Christian Peacekeepers is a very intense. I mean, I played with the idea once when I was younger, 15 years ago, to go back and I had this romantic vision of going to Hebron and being on the Christian Peacekeeper team, but it's hard work. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart, because you're out on the streets, you're out shielding children going to and from school from settlers. I mean, you're very much putting your life on the line, and it's tough work. It's important work, but it's tough work. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not, let's go to Israel for 3 months and be a Christian peacekeeper. It's gonna be more than just, sitting in a very modest, simple apartment in Hebron, not being able to do much of anything. But I mean, your call is to help and to serve. This would be intense.
Yeah. Thank you. And so there was also, just within the Q&A, and it might have made its way to the chat as well, just referencing Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb's, his work, Faith in the Face of Empire, as well as Walter Brueggemann's Chosen, that speak a bit to the question of the land, if that is something that interests you specifically. So sorry, just trying to get through all of the question. So we can see what would be next. Thanks for bearing with us as we go through the questions. And it looks like Shannon was trying to reconnect. I'm not sure if she will be able to. And we're unfortunate. I know that technology is very helpful at this time, but also can be a bit challenging. So maybe I'll just ask David if you want to give any final words at this time.
Well, thank you for having us. I'm sorry, Shannon. I know what that's like to get frozen on your screen. This has been a humbling hour. I think my hope is that folks who've been on this webinar I hope we've been able to share some of our own experience, and that you will get involved, especially as we move towards annexation, to continue praying for the people of the West Bank and Palestinians, to pray for Israel, to pray that there'll be wisdom at some point in leadership, and that there will be peace. The reality is, what is the future of the two-state solution? It very well might be gone. And what does that mean? Does it mean that there could be work towards one state of equality? I don't know. There are more questions than there are answers, and but I encourage everyone on the call, if this is your first experience, get involved in whatever way you can in your community. If you're in Delaware, contact me, and we would love to have you with Delaware Churches for Middle East Peace. It's a very good group that meets. But be curious and keep fighting.
Thank you, Reverend Andrews. And I'm sorry if we did not get to your question, or if they were more political. Please feel free to reach out with questions to info@cmep.org, and someone from CMEP staff can get that to you, can get an answer to you. And again, in the follow-up email with the link to this viewing will also include some of the resources that were mentioned. So thank you again, Reverend David. Thank you, Reverend Shannon. And we will look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Kyle.
Everyone.
Thank you.